Well, we're very honored, and I'm personally very excited, and I know many of you share this excitement to have Dr. Jankowski as our keynote speaker for today. She's someone whose her work is something that has informed the development of our outcomes assessment in our assessment office and a lot of the work that we do around not only high impact practices but assessment at this campus. So I'm very honored to have Dr. Jankowski with us today. She's the former executive director of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, NILOA. She also served as a faculty member within the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is co-author of the book, Using Evidence of Student Learning to Improve Higher Education, as well as co-author of Degrees That Matter, Moving Higher Education to a Learning Systems Paradigm, and co-editor of Student-Focused Learning and Assessment, Involving Students in the Learning Process in Higher Education. She also has a forthcoming book which focuses on equity and assessment. Her areas of focus include assignment design, transparency, evidence-based storytelling, equity, mapping and alignment of learning, and all things assessment. A lot of things that you've heard if you're involved in assessment at any level on this campus. Natasha is the recipient of Kent State University's Alumni Award and the Young Alumni Award for the College of Education at UIUC. NILOA was the proud recipient of the ACPA Contribution to Higher Education Award under her leadership. She holds a PhD in higher education from the University of Illinois, an MA in higher education administration from Kent State University, and a BA in philosophy from Illinois State University. So again, thank you for being here, Dr. Jankowski, and I look forward to learning from you in the next hour or so with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the welcome and happy birthday, Dr. Weber.
Thank you.
It's an extra surprise for May 4th. So I'm going to go
May the 4th be with you.
Yes. And with your spirit, I believe was the change that was made from that. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can switch. The one that's up, Donald, if you don't mind. And but I'm so excited to be a part of the inaugural Pedagogy Forum. Like, what better thing to talk about than teaching and learning and our students and all of that. So let me go ahead and get that share going. Everyone see that okay? Thumbs up. Okay. And so what I really want to talk about is thinking about inclusive practice and high impact and what does this all mean in terms of cultural responsive practice? And there's so much else that's going on throughout your sessions today that will be addressing student perceptions of COVID-19. I saw there's some great things on feminist informed and care-driven pedagogy, which just sounds fascinating. Community engaged learning, thinking about open classrooms, how do we support metacognition, thinking about how do we support students engaging with digital documents. So it really sounds like a wonderful assessment learning community that's focused on inquiry and sharing of practices is unfolding. And I'm very excited to be a start of that conversation today. And I also have to give a shout out that I saw in the program sponsored tables, my co-author, Dr. David Marshall, will be talking about the honors program, and congratulations to David on being Chapter Advisor of the Year award and the designation of star status by NSCS for honors. So way to go. All sorts of things to celebrate today when we get into this. So let me tell you about what we're going to do in our time together today. I'm going to do a bit of a brief welcome and sort of position where we are in getting into knowing one another for our time in this keynote. And then I'm going to get into thinking about considering some definitions of key terms. And I know that seems very riveting and exciting, but we'll make it as interesting as possible to get into the conversation on really understanding what do we mean when we talk about something that's high impact and something that's inclusive and something that is culturally responsive for our students. And then I want to explore some implications for practice based on how we think about our definitions and our work in this space, and then get into examples and resources that can inform that work moving forward. And when we get to the examples and resources, I'm going to pause because while I have some to share, if there are specific examples that you're looking for or something that you'd really like to know to inform your practice, please feel free to ask at that point, and I am happy to make sure that you're getting the material and information that you need at that, in addition to other ones. So that's really what we'll get into. Then we'll wrap up with some time for questions and answer. And Tom will come back and we'll see what you have to say, or other places that maybe I didn't touch in that you were really hoping to learn about today. But that will pretty much wrap up what our focus is. So a few things I think that are important to get into as we start to kick off as part of our welcome. Is I am a bit of a fast talker when I get into these things. I get really excited about assessment and I start talking very quickly. This, I believe, is recorded, so you can go back and watch it on a slower speed. You also will have the PowerPoint slides, but if there's anything that you want me to talk about differently, come up with a different example, go back over, please feel free to let me know. It's one of those that I'm aware that I'm doing it, but I have yet to interrupt the process of talking too quickly. So we'll get through it together. And then the second sort of tidbit of information is that I'm in Central Time, so my son will be coming home from school, and I have 2 dogs that might greet him in the manner of their people. And so if you get to hear Isabel and Daisy, they're equally excited about assessment as I am. But they may have a guest appearance, they might not. We'll work through it, but regardless. So on to our welcome for our time today. So in addition to Dr. Weber's birthday, it is also May the 4th. Be with you. So we can't have a talk on this day and not get into that. And for those that are like, what the heck is this that you're talking about? I offer you an entertaining meme that you might find funny or not. If Star Wars is not your bag, if you want to mash up of different opportunities, there you go. So that other fun things about May 4th. Kent State University, 1970, is today. Songs about it, wonderful, great documentary video. It's also the day that 13 civil rights activists, dubbed the Freedom Riders, got on a bus and headed to the South. So I think it's a good day to get into some good trouble in thinking about how are we inclusive in our practices. So lots to celebrate for May 4th. But what I want to get us into is thinking about what are our foundations and basics? And by that, we need to really get into definitions. A lot of time in this work, whether it's about high impact practices or assessment, we jump into the doing. We jump into the I need to get this done. We need to start moving forward. And we skip that sort of, what are we doing? And what does this really mean? And what are we talking about phase? And so we're gonna spend some time doing that. What I'd love to invite each of you to do is share in the chat. So keep the Q&A section for if you have questions, because that'll help us sort them out later. There's the chat option. Please feel free to, in the chat, share some of the definitions of what it means to you for inclusive teaching, or high impact or culturally responsive. Pick one that speaks to you and think about that. And if you're not very much of a definition person, you're kind of like, no, I'm good, I don't want to do definitions, completely fine. Feel free to share a meaningful learning experience that you had, whether that was a learning experience you had, whether it was one with your students, whatever that might be. But please feel free to take a moment and share with each other any thoughts or comments or definitions that you might have. If you don't have access to the chat, I guess you can put in Q&A. We'll just mark it as answered. But I will give you some time to do that. But in the interest of our conversation, I'm going to keep moving us along. But think about your own definitions as we walk through this, because part of this is that there's not really agreement collectively on what we mean by these places. So what is inclusive teaching? Let's just start with the concept of inclusivity. And I think that our thoughts around inclusive teaching have really shifted during the pandemic and the learning situations that we've been in terms of distance education or remote instruction, maybe in that light. And so I want to offer a consideration that came from the Chronicle of Higher Education Teaching newsletter, which really talks about, from a panel where they had people talking about, well, what is inclusive teaching today? That it's an intentional approach that we're taking into account our students' varied backgrounds, beliefs, and identities so that they feel as though they have something to contribute by meeting students where they are. And I think that's a good start of thinking about what does it mean to be inclusive. We have other people that are students, and how are we thinking about bringing our students in? And they went on to include an example in this piece. that was an illustration of a faculty member that was in biochemistry, where the majority of students that come into this specific class are lower income, first generation women of color, and they need to do lab reports. And instead of starting with going, this is what a lab report looks like, and we're going to figure out how to do lab reports, they started by going, okay, figure out how to talk about what's coming from a lab experience in a way that makes sense to you, your own vocabulary and style, through poetry, through music, whatever that might be. Moving into what parts of that show into lab reports, how does that differ in terms of who we're communicating to in different areas? So by the end of the course, they're able to write proper lab reports, but starting by meeting them where they are and bringing in the way that they're thinking about moving in that direction. And I think that's a nice example to get into and to share. But in that same panel discussion, I want to bring up the point that was raised by Dr. Tourbe-Lagrave, which was, yeah, but most of the work that happens like that is by our colleagues of color. And there's also just a ton of fatigue in our faculty. We have been in this remote situation where we're constantly trying to pivot what we're doing to reach our students, engage with them in meaningful ways, really ensure that we're getting learning across. And it's exhausting to try to do this in a medium such as this, but also, and the length of time and the sort of, we started a sprint that turned into a marathon that never ended. And that's just a lot. And so thinking about how are we supposed to, as faculty, really be able to support our students at the time that we find ourselves in as a country, what they're going through in their lived experiences, to really, within our academic community, support each other and heal when we ourselves might be struggling. And I think a great example of this is sort of with the working remote lived experience that's unfolding of, you know, what all the different areas that we have to navigate within that situation, in addition to just the amount of time spent working in our Zoom fatigue maybe, but also just the larger fatigue of grieving for events that we didn't get to do in terms of graduation or the current state of democracy and policy, potentially, just the sheer loss of life from COVID that has been going on. There's a lot that we haven't been able to, I think, process, go through milestones of celebrations and things of that. And so what I think that the inclusive part of thinking about teaching where we find ourselves now in 2021 is really reminding us of community and empathy, and thinking about how are we engaging in meeting our students with community in mind and with empathy in our approach. And so for us to be inclusive, really, we need to be working together in a supportive community. But how do we go about doing that? Given tensions and given everything that was shared by Dr. Tourbe-Lagrave in terms of everything that we're going through. And my answer to that is, all right, well, we got to refocus on students. Students are good. If we think about inclusion, one of the people we need to include is students and student learning, not focusing on our policy, not focusing on bureaucracy and the reporting and the things of that. But if we, and if you want later, or if you want to have a side conversation with me about proctoring and online and my thoughts on that, we can do that. This is not the time or the place at this moment, but please feel free to let me know. But for now, when we think about these definitions and we think about inclusive teaching that was shared in that Chronicle piece, it sounds very similar to culturally relevant pedagogy that comes from Gloria Ladson-Billings' work. And Dr. Ladson-Billings recommends using that culturally relevant approach as a way for students in populations that are outside the majority. So outside of the majority of who our students, our institutions have been made to serve, let's say, to maintain their culture while succeeding academically. So that when they come into our classrooms, when they come into an experience of learning, when they come into our virtual environment, that we are not asking them to leave their culture behind. And there is my dear beloved Isabel. She's a hound dog, so you may actually get like a deep-throated bay sort of sound. It's quite endearing. But that we don't need to ask our students to give something up to be here and a student and succeed, that because of who they are, they can be successful and they're bringing something that's important to bear to that learning experience. So culturally relevant pedagogy really aims to produce students who achieve academically while demonstrating cultural competence, and that can understand and critique the social order and say, here are places where we can do better, and we must, and we can, and we will. Through that, we use examples of students' culture in an asset-based approach. We're not asking them to be like something else. We want them to really engage with what they bring, with course material that is relevant to them and their learning. So what it does is it asks us to involve students in the process of learning and assessing learning. So think of students on one end as a co-creator, using appropriate language for our students so we can actually communicate with them in meaningful ways about what we're asking them to do in assignments or in a syllabi or in a learning experience or in a high impact practice. And then come up with how do we capture that and document that in meaningful ways that lift our students up and elevate that learning. So it's really ensuring that our focus is on students. So if we have this inclusive practice about and culturally relevant pedagogy, thinking about involving students and culture in interesting ways in our process of learning, how does that connect to high impact practices? And if we're in a definition place, what the heck is a high impact practice anyway? We're familiar with there's a list, but what does that actually mean from a definitional standpoint? So in part, I want to back us up to where did we end up focusing on high impact practices? Where did this work come out of so we can understand where it's ended up in terms of how we engage with our learners in that approach? So in part, the focus within high impact practices came about from a desire that we had in our institutions to ensure that students participate in meaningful learning experiences. When you're at our institutions, when you're with us in a learning experience, we want it to be meaningful. That seems like something that we can agree on. But what is a meaningful learning experience, you might ask? Great question. To get there, we have to sort of start with a scholarship on engagement and what that means. And so the work on engagement within behind the data that supports high impact practices really started with an assumption that there are many factors we cannot control in our institutions of higher education. We cannot change your family educational background. We cannot change your incoming academic preparation. We cannot change sort of certain other environmental factors and things like that. But one thing that we could influence that was sort of agreed upon in this space was that we can influence engagement and the engagement of students. So why do we focus on increasing engagement? Well, it's one thing we can focus on, but what is it about engagement and what do we mean in engagement that comes into the high impact practices? Well, research on high impact practices looked at engagement data. So they looked at the things that students reported that they were doing to figure out what types of things students participated in, and then what the relationship was between participating in that with things like retention, persistence, grades, on metrics that really matter to thinking about students moving through. So for instance, you have thinking about HIPS better the aggregate. So I want to just really quickly point through a couple of things in this finding, because this is a common thread as we think about what backs up our high impact practice research. So overall, students participate, we look in aggregate, in 1.3 HIP experiences. I don't know if that's like you get into part of it and you're like, nah, I'm good. I don't want to leave. Non-first generation students participate more than first generation. So your students that have a history or family of going through are engaged in that. White students participated more than Asian American and Hispanic students, but not more than African American students. Again, this is aggregate national data. And transfer students participated more than non-transfer students. Interestingly enough, a lot of this work does not engage in thinking about intersectionality of a first generation Hispanic student that's transferred and what that engagement looks like in HIPS. And there has been, we'll talk about critiques on the high impact practice literature in a minute. Some of that comes from thinking about that piece. But for participation in HIPS, and I won't say engagement, I will say participation. This is you just showed up and did it. Other factors within a student's lived experience like work, family care, and the like doesn't show up in here. And so when you go, okay, well, this sounds fine. Where does this research come from? Where are they gathering this information? That is an interesting question. It comes from student self-reported surveys on what they've been participating in. So from students, the National Survey of Student Engagement, which is a nationally normed instrument given out to institutions that participate in that. students say, I've been doing these things, and then we look at the relational gains related to that. So we know that there are associated student gains in gen ed, personal and social development, some practical competence in those areas. We also know that there's some compensatory effect on first year grades and persistence from participating in high impact practice, regardless of controlling for quality or what that engagement might look like. But we also know there are some concerns in how this research was done in terms of which institutions are in the National Student Survey of Engagement data set, how norms get associated around that, that certain types of HIPs are open or high impact practices are shared more often or more willing to be engaged with certain types of students that can actually enable microaggressions and stereotypes. That HIPs had not been studied with a clear looking at issues of race and ethnicity, and that thinking about how we examine the participation within that was really focused on how do we get more students that aren't participating to be like our white students that are participating a lot in that space. And so putting the burden of participation on students and thinking about how to move in that direction. Now, additional studies sort of looked across and said, all right, how are we thinking about these different areas and getting into the space? And I'll say overall, what we can say about high impact practices in terms of that engagement piece, because that's what we were interested in. We want students to be more engaged. That's where this research comes around. They are collectively effective, but not uniformly effective. Which means that how we implement them matters and what it's about matters in terms of what students actually get out of it. What we also saw from some of the sort of first original getting into engagement, it was institutions latched on to, there's a benefit here, and if you engage, that's where the payoff comes. So it became sort of the thou shalt implement 3 high impact practices, and we want all our students to participate in them, and we sent surveys and inventories out to say who's doing service learning so we can track and map it. And we didn't really get into assessment of learning from it or quality in that space. And so I was delighted, not surprised, but delighted that the high impact practice committee was like, wait, what are we doing here at CSUSB? And is this what we want to be doing beyond the list, and thinking about how are we ensuring that our students are getting quality learning experiences? So specifically for high impact practices in STEM education at Hispanic serving institutions, Lozano and colleagues found that HIPs are often culturally isolated. So if we think about our earlier conversation on definition of inclusive and cultural responsiveness, they're culturally isolated and not sufficiently inclusive. Now, while this focus was on STEM, there are some common threads. And so I want to just point a couple things out that are in this. It's a nice report. If anyone wants to read it, the link is there, and you'll have the slides so you can engage in it as well. But that it was really thinking about how do you ensure that there are certain activities like undergraduate research where faculty are going to seek out students that are perceived as academically ready, where faculty perceive that these students would have relevance for an undergraduate research project. They're going to do something with that later, and that they have the time to commit to engaging in something like that, which is often unpaid or may even include more credit hours associated with it. So I'm paying for that, which are not highly prevalent among the students that Hispanic serving institutions seek to serve. And so what they need, their recommendation was not get them to do more, it was to transform the traditional research practices that are trying to be mirrored in ways that actually serve the Hispanic students. Fantastic, love it. Let's transform it to actually be about how do we implement something that matters to our students. To keep that idea of transformation going, I want to point to another recommendation in the same report, which was looking at that culturally responsive practices are inconsistently understood and practiced at Hispanic serving institutions. Now, several things to say about this. This might be about institutions that became Hispanic serving institutions based on student population numbers and not by mission, not by saying this is who we are, this is what we're about. And there is a distinction between serving Hispanic serving institutions that actually care about serving and are engaged in serving, and those that are like, well, we have students, but maybe the population will change as it goes. But the point raised in this recommendation was that it's really moving from simply making high impact practices and experiences available to students, but to rethinking how we deploy those practices so they specifically benefit the populations we're trying to serve. So we really want to say it's high impact for our students here. It's not we're adopting a high impact practice. We're ensuring that the practices we engage with for our students are implemented and chosen in a way that leads to high impact for our students. And that's it. That's where it's at, I think, as we get into really what we want high impact practices to be. So that means we also need to have a balance between high impact and cultural responsiveness, which is a tension that's raised in some of the recommendations here, that if we need it to be high impact for a specific population, that practice needs to be culturally responsive to that population. It needs to be inclusive for that target population, or the way that we implement it might be different. And none of these recommendations in that conversation focused on the list. It focused on practices that get to high impact for students, which is very similar to the 8 key elements that come up from the work that was like, whoa, yeah, there's a list, but it's not just the list. There are high impact practices because it's pedagogical approaches that we know have worked for years. There's key elements that go across through it. For instance, performance expectations that are set high. If we set high expectations for our students, they're likely to meet them. If we spend time and energy with our students, more than just a course, but thinking about throughout their academic journey, our students do better. If they have more interactions that matter, our students and our faculty are doing better. If we have feedback that's timely, that I can do something with, the actual research we know on effective and meaningful feedback, if I can reflect and integrate my learning. So I'm not just having discrete learning experiences, but I'm thinking about how my learning integrates over time. All of those things are wonderful, meaningful pedagogical approaches that can happen in a wide variety of ways that are impactful for our students and might not look specifically like the list. And even in the description of the practices, and I know this is tiny, so I'm not expecting you to read it, especially with all our like Zoom eyes now that like I'm on like my second pair of glasses in a year. My eyesight's going, it's bad. But when we think about what's in some of these like first year seminars and experiences, it's not that you have a first year seminar experience. It's about thinking about collaborative learning. That's the part that gets it. It's the collaborative learning within a community. It's the integration. It's the reflection. It's those larger pieces. So when we look at the more even fulsome descriptions that show up with the list, it's about pedagogy in that space. What happens though is we have national surveys that have to ask questions about engagement in certain types of things. And in doing that, we start to narrow our focus in some ways that might not be most amenable to our students. And so I think what that raises for me to say to you in your inaugural pedagogy forum is thinking about what are the high impact practices for CSUSB. And if it's not on this list, add to the list. The list gets added to all the time, so that's not a problem. Define what the inclusive practices are that really make a difference for your students. And this list was made pre-pandemic. I am not going to be surprised if pandemic learning involves a very different list. And it has some elements in here that we hadn't thought about. But what will persist is that the focus on these are realized through collaboration, through community, through integration, through application, through our inclusive pedagogy. And why does all of that matter? Well, it matters because Hispanic serving institutions are the centers of educational equity and excellence for Latinas and Latinos, particularly those who may be first generation and are low income. And I think that's the important part. When we think about how we want our students to succeed and engage in this, it matters because especially for our first generation students, we do not need to add additional hurdles to participation for them to be here. We don't need to say, oh, you work part-time or full-time, we're going to require you do an internship in addition to that. We need to rethink and retransform what's meaningful about an internship. And if that's the meaningful part, how can you get that from what you're already doing or what you bring to bear? So we're actually meeting our students where they are and engaging with them very differently. And that will help us help our students as well in hopefully meaningful ways. When we think about that title as well of serving within Hispanic serving institutions that sort of define that servingness, there's this great recommendation for list for Hispanic serving institution leaders. And I just want to point out a couple before moving out of our definition thing, that for high impact within this, we really need to think about How do we think about that servingness in practice in ways that comes through a race conscious lens, as item 2 talks about, in our campus environment that is positive and affirming, so culturally responsive, that's fantastic, that enhances the cultural wealth and knowledge that our students bring to campus, and really prioritizes measures those numerous academic and non-academic outcomes of interest along that spectrum of servingness. And if we're thinking about serving our students in ways that are impactful to them, we'll get where we want to go in all of that space. And that, I think, is the important part. What we struggle with, though, is that this came from this student engagement piece of high impact practice that came from surveys of student engagement. So when we juxtapose sort of these two conceptions of high impact practices as the practices that we engage in that matter for our students and give them meaningful experiences, with sort of how that's been transformed by engagement data, it's helpful for us to go back and look at, well, how are we defining student engagement in the first place? And what it is defined as educationally propositive activities, purposeful educational activities. That can be anything, which is great. That gives us lots of flexibility. And that those engagement activities can be academic, cognitive, social, behavioral. They can be both. They can be about active learning. Really, it's about ways in which we've purposefully designed educational experiences to support our students. And that can be a wide variety of ways in which we do that. What that matters as well as we think about from student engagement, and especially helping our first generation students with that sense of belonging, to say, I am actually engaging in a way that makes sense to me with this institution and my learning experiences, means that engagement is going to look different than our traditional conceptions of engagement, because it's first generation college student engagement. And that's okay. It looks different because it is different. That's not a bad thing, because what we really want from our students in all of these experiences is the part of mattering. We're going to Schlossberg, if you want any of that pieces, where our students are going, okay, you notice me, you know when I'm here, when I'm not here, you know what I'm bringing to this, that my success or failure matters to this institution beyond just a number in getting through in a retention or persistence manner, and that we need you to help us figure out how to address this. We need to partner with our students to know what experiences are meaningful and impactful to you, and how we can meet you where you are and what you're bringing into that, and that we appreciate you, that we appreciate all the things that you've brought in with you, and that being inclusive is how we are high impact, engaging in it in that way. So that's our big definitions as we think about high impact practices as more than a list, but the history of where this comes from the conversations that have unfolded that get sort of lost when we look at survey data of how many students report participating in certain things. And so I think it's just helpful as we get into a day of reflecting on pedagogy to start with remembering how we ended up in this space in the first place. And it's because we want students to engage in meaningful educational experiences that are inclusive and that show that they matter. And that sounds fantastic. That sounds like something that we could definitely do. So what does that mean then in terms of our implications for practice? And I want to move through this quickly so we can get into if there's examples specifically you want or some questions that you have. But when we think about what does that all mean for our practice in this space, well, first off, it means that our high impact practices are not like a field of dreams where if we make them, students will come. We can't just sort of be like, we build a field, it's a ball diamond, come and participate in a community. Instead, we need to think about how do we support learning experiences that get to the impact, not as one-offs, but as a collective. How do we as an institution, as a program, really live our mission and get our students to where we want to go? And also remembering that some things that worked before will not work now. We're in a pandemic transition period, still in pandemic. The ripple effects of how this has impacted our student lives will continue to persist and last. The inequities that have been elevated, they were there, but it's just now like you can't miss it, aren't going to go away. And so we need to rethink as well what's impactful now for our students that is still inclusive and culturally responsive. So what are some of the things that we can do about that? Well, we can think about being careful of how we use our surveys. We can think about also not holding our students responsible for their involvement and participation. My caution here on surveys is what we see happen most often around institutions is we survey students about what they do. We don't survey our institutions or our faculty sort of about quality or learning in that space. We do ask sometimes how many of you are engaged in service learning, let's say, for instance. But the research that we pull from is national, which means we look at a lot of norms. And the norms that we look at for student behavior really come from predominantly white institutions and traditional age students. So we end up going, oh, I want to be more like this institution that's in my peer group, maybe, that I made. And how does that pan out? Which might not be the best way to think about how we engage with these surveys, because what we end up doing is we norm traditional student behavior as this is how a good student engages with our institution. And we try to get our other students that have their own ways of moving through an institution that's neither good nor bad, it's just how they are, to be like a different student group. And I've even seen things like, if you want to be an engaged student, you would do X, Y, and Z, and that's not what we need to be doing. Because what happens when we engage in that, and this is just a picture of a video, don't worry, I'm not going to see the video, is when we survey student participation in these discrete activities that get to that norming, it becomes a selective attention tool where we miss other things. We miss the ways that our students are showing us what's high impact that we are doing. We miss what our list is of practices that matter, that meet our students and our faculty for what we can and cannot do, especially when we think about self-care and mental health at this time. But it means that we look at certain things at the expense of others. They become like blinders. And so when we get entrenched in that survey data, we want more students to participate. We need more numbers up, regardless of if it's a meaningful experience, regardless of if it gets in the way of their structural barriers for our students, and if it's not actually high impact in the sense that we see that payoff. So if our experience the students have is disconnected from learning, or we're adding a new structural barrier by putting a requirement in the way for something that our students' lived experience just does not afford, we further marginalize students instead of being inclusive in how we think about and doing that with students. So what can you do in practice? Well, Ashley Finley wrote a really nice paper to provide some ideas and concepts in this space that talks about intentional design of our high impact practices. So not just that we have them, but what are we doing and how do we want to implement it in ways that matter? And she does it by connecting assessment and pedagogy to high impact practices. And clearly I'm biased as an assessment person, but you really need pedagogy and assessment to come together with the hips to get the thing you want to see. And she uses a logic model. So if you're into like organizing things in columns, this is for you. If you're not into that, that's fine. I have a different slide for you in a minute. And this comes from a Kellogg Foundation logic model guide to think about what do we need to go into implementing something that's high impact. And what she adds in here that I think is fantastic is along the bottom, a piece on assumptions. What are we assuming about our students' lived experiences, about our institution, about our abilities to do these things? What's going on in that space, which is really key for us to implement in meaningful ways. And she also looks at what inputs do we have? What are the processes? I would argue that an input that we have is also our students and their feedback in those spaces, but we can kind of map out in a way to think about what are we doing? What's going on in the space? What are all those pieces? And she raises all these questions in that paper that are not, how do I get more students to do high impact practices, or just tell me how to assess this particular instance, but instead say things like, what's the process by which we examine the learning that comes from students participating in a high impact practice? How are we really looking at that? She asks, if we focus on learning, what are high impact practices for students? Which is that whole, what's our list for us? Is the high impact practice inclusive of the lived experience of our learners? Is it intentionally designed, or is it just something we do? And we say, hey, go do this thing. And are we missing other opportunities to really connect in meaningful ways with our learners by focusing on one piece and not something else? In a toolkit, that came from work that built from the work that Dr. Marshall and I did in writing the Degrees That Matter, where we were looking at like 800 institutions that had been trying to do all this mapping and things of that work on learning systems. There's an extension of the mapping process that we can think about when it gets into high impact practices. And so this table really helps kind of signify some of those connections and links it to learning. So we're not just doing this stagnantly, but we're doing it to get at learning. And you can even add additional columns to this, like cultural responsiveness or inclusivity, or where do you want student involvement to be, or how are you thinking about pedagogy? And so you can curate this to make those connections clear if that's something that you're interested in. But what it asks about is what is this high impact practice? Sure, where is it going on? But what do we want students to get out from it? What's the learning outcome? And the beautiful thing about doing something like that is if there's a learning outcome that we want, there are many ways to get to a learning outcome. And if I as a student can't participate in this one thing, I might be able to do something else that has the same learning impact, that gets to the same pieces, but meets me where I am and does not add stress and burden. And so thinking about how we map these relations and connections can really help us get into some of those spaces. And I think that's important. Last sort of thought and thinking about these areas before we move into some questions you can ask in your practice are, we have to get into the conversations on inclusivity, and we need to have these definitional conversations because they're assumptions that we do not question in our practice that get in our way. So ensuring that we draw attention to things that matter to get to inclusive and culturally responsive HIPs, we need to be aware of and navigate structural issues and assumptions like most of our standardized measures and theories come from PWIs, white students. And if we're going, oh, that worked there and we're going to do it here, maybe not, maybe we need to think about it and how it relates to our context. We also value certain demonstrations of learning over others, and in that way really limit what our students can put forward and get into that space. With that, we're not so great as institutions about valuing narrative and personal experience in the same way that we do institutional decision-making for quantitative data. We explain and rationalize student voice away. So even if our students come and tell us something about what's effective or not effective for them, we need to ensure that we don't go, oh, well, I know what's good for you, and put it over there in a different space. And we also need to remember that our students are experts of their own experience. They are the ones that live this. They know themselves the best. And to get to inclusivity, we really need to examine the assumptions that we have at play and our structures to ensure that we aren't saying one thing, but doing something else. And that shows up, especially in a history of promoting the benefit of most educational interventions, whether it's high impact practices, whether it's diversity, whether it's equity, based on the benefit to our white students. And a lot of that research builds from that, and we have to cite it and engage in it, then we're really limiting ourselves unnecessarily. And we're citing a canon that does not apply with us. So what we really need is that context-specific, high-impact practices for the students we have and we serve. So what works for our students here? That's the thing that we need to know. Earlier, I mentioned that I'm happy to talk at a later point in time about proctoring, and I'm not going to go down that. But I will say that this is a good example of a mismatch between our stated espoused values and our lived ones, where in pandemic learning, there are assumptions in institutional policy that are full of conflicting messages to our students that can also hinder high impact practice. Some of those are thinking about our engagement models and our theories, which were built off of a learning experience that is no longer to be assumed. Some of that is our predictive analytic models. We're based on past performance in a completely different environment that is not applicable to our current situation for our students. And of course, we have what are our assumptions behind effectiveness of online learning and proctoring and all of that. So there's a lot to think about. We're a community that can solve it. And one of the best ways that we could do that is involving students. We need to take a critical stance, and we need to involve our students in helping us solve these problems by asking them, what is it that they really want? And asking ourselves, what is it that we really want our students to experience? What kind of learning environment and learning do we want that to be? And how do we want to support that? Because what we don't want to end up with is where students are going, I don't know why I had to do something, but they just told me to do it. We don't want llama education for our students where they're like, I did these activities and I still don't see the integration and connection. Because if you remember the pedagogy part, reflection, integration, collaborative learning, all of that is what made them high impact. So if our students are running around a llama, they don't know why. We've missed what we're trying to go. So I would argue that we need to reflect more in this space, ask some questions on things. And Estella Ben-Simone in the Equity Scorecard has wonderful resources to pull from to do this, to really say, in what ways are we failing our students? It starts from an assumption that we are, and then builds from there. So we can jump over, it's a critical stance. We can jump over the like, prove to me that we're doing this. Like, let's just assume our institutions were built for a totally different group of students. There's gonna be stuff we've missed. How are we going to address it, and which way, how are we looking at our practices to ensure we do this? And so if you haven't looked at equity scorecard work, it's fantastic. What that means for our practice is that to answer these questions, we need to ask our students, but we have a range of comfort level with our involvement of asking students. But engaging students, high impact practice, undergraduate research, they can run focus groups, they can do all of these quantitative reasoning to look at survey data and give feedback, they can participate in oral communication for presentations. But we sort of have this, we use students as the object of assessment to, students can actually identify issues and the solutions, huge spectrum. And across the top, we're kind of like, okay, we know what's good for you, so we'll change it. To, well, maybe we need some student voice. So there's a student representative on a committee. To, well, we put a thing together and we'll run it by the students at the end to see if you're okay. But at this point, it's pretty much done. And we're just kind of looking for your seal of approval. To on the bottom, sort of how we move along with data, we're like, well, we disaggregated it. That's cool. But then we blame our students for the differences. Like, these students need to do these things, or you need to be more like this other student. To then going, okay, let's ask some of those equity scorecard questions and examine our organizational structures and what's going on in there, to going, we need student voice. We need surveys, we need focus groups, we need to understand on the ground, like, what the heck is going on and happening, and how do we put this together? So this is a matter of comfort and where you are, and thinking about where you want to be with students' involvement, but this is also a great way to get to inclusivity in that space. So if I had to sum all of that up, I would just say that I think it means that we need to reflect before acting. We need to think about our students. We need to be inclusive. We need to be culturally responsive, and really answer for us, what is high impact? What does that mean? And what does that look like? So how can I know it when I see it, and engage my students in that? And all of that means for that work can happen in our classroom. It can happen in the form of assignments. We can do this. The work of Marianne Winklemas showed that if you get clear in your assignment prompt, you can close equity gaps. If you get clear in your assignment prompt, you can close equity gaps. Seems like a high impact practice to me in terms of also being inclusive, because the clarity was, what is it that you're asking me to do in language I can understand? How is what I'm bringing to this fit into here? How am I a part of this assignment? And getting those changes in, that's an inclusive practice to engage in. And so this is something that we can do today in our practice, in our classes, that get us there through the work that Marianne did in her NSF grant, and wrote a book on it as well. Check it out. But you can also ask questions about your assignment to just sort of look at, like, am I doing what I thought I wanted to do? What is it that I'm really asking students to do in this space? And then even adding some questions on, does this make sense for our lived experiences, for both my students and for me? Is this where I can engage and do things to meet my students where we are? These are all doable, and these are all things that get us to our end goal of our students being engaged in meaningful educational experiences, which is where all of this work came from in the first place, and which is also sort of the root of inclusive pedagogy. So I will wrap up there and say I'm happy to share any specific examples and resources, answer any questions that you might have. The slide copies that you will get as you're thinking of your questions and typing it in include a variety of sort of different, the most often asked things that we get on high impact practices, like, can you show me an example of this? They're in the slides, so you'll have all of that for when you need it. But yes, I hope that helps to sort of think about how pedagogy is the key to really making our work inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Jankowski. Yeah, we have about a couple minutes. We have time for a question. So again, just use the Q&A feature and we'll be able to see your questions. So if you have any questions for Dr. Jankowski, please go ahead and place them in the Q&A. And also, of course, if any of our panelists have any questions for Dr. Jankowski.
Yes. I'll just say I'm very excited about all the work that's going on at CSUSB, and I think as an institution, you provide a wealth of examples from which others can learn to really think about how to engage in this work. And so take this conversation as one of reaffirming and lifting up the directions and the work in which you're moving. So.
And thank you very much for that. And I'll just say, so much of, I really appreciated the focus on questions, on inquiry, because, that's what research is rooted in, right? And so I was wondering if you have maybe experiences or examples or thought about intersections of teacher-based research, like interdisciplinary teacher-based research, right? And high impact practices, because I feel like these are the kinds of things that could really fit together. And then we have questions coming in too.
Yeah, definitely. And I also apologize to all of our attendees today. I should have added to my I talk fast that I also give you an overwhelming amount of information. So you'll be mulling this over, and then you can get in conversations with each other as scholars and talk as it continues. So this is conversation starter, not stop here and end, which is exactly connected to inquiry. So I think where we have seen this work really connect to that is within a scholarship of teaching and learning, where people within their disciplines are going, there are really impactful ways to talk about what it means to be a scholar in my disciplinary space, and how I talk about that to others, how we engage in dialogue and debate of ideas is a democratic skill that we need more of, I would say holistically, but something that way that we talk and engage in inquiry with each other as faculty is part of that way of having high expectations and dialogue engagement that we can do with our students that gets to that high impact of their connection to a discipline as well. And so thinking about how we bring our disciplinary stances and dialogue into our classroom to talk with our students as an introduction to now, welcome to English as a discipline. And this is how we approach problems and how we define things, and how do you see yourself in relation to that is definitely a rooted, time-tested approach to get into. So yes, inquiry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That is our time. Thank you to everybody for being here. Just a reminder that you can find all the links in the program, right? So each of the individual roundtables, we're moving on to roundtables now, and you can find the links in the program as well as in the chat, and up on your screen right now, you can get Zoom IDs. And again, just a reminder to come back here at the end at 3:45. We'll have some closing remarks here as well. But thank you again so much, and I look forward to seeing you in some of the panels, everybody that's here. And thank you again to Dr. Jankowski.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jankowski. Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks all.